Hi folks, and welcome to Korchik's class, where we analyze and review some of the major topics in global politics. Today, we're going to be looking at the topic of nonviolence as a way to approach conflict and try to resolve conflict. And what do we think of when we think of nonviolence? We might think of some of the really big examples of nonviolent movements, things like Gandhi in the quest for Indian independence from British imperialism. Or we might think of Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement and lots of different ways of nonviolent protests and civil disobedience that tried to bring an end to racial injustice and segregation in the United States. And those are important because they show us the power of those nonviolent actions to make change. But nonviolent movements and nonviolent ways to approach conflict are so much more common in our society, and they are a powerful tool that all of us have the power to use in order to influence change in our societies. If we remember back to John Galtung, his definition of peace and positive peace was the absence of violence in conflict resolution, because at the end of the day, conflicts will always happen, but we want to aim to find ways to be able to resolve those conflicts non-violently. And so these non-violent methods are very important in being able to achieve that. Because those conflicts will still arise, we need some methodology in able to be able to approach those conflicts. And one of the foremost political scientists in nonviolent methods of action was Dr. Gene Sharp, who was the founder of the Albert Einstein Institution for Nonviolent Action. And the Albert Einstein Institution's definition of nonviolent action is that it is a technique of socio-political action for applying power in a conflict without the use of physical violence. Nonviolent action may involve acts of omission. That is, people may refuse to perform acts that they usually perform, are expected by custom to perform, or are required by law or regulation to perform. Or acts of commission. That is, people may perform acts that they do not usually perform, or are not expected by custom to perform, or are forbidden to perform, or a combination of the two. To help achieve this, the Albert Einstein Institution developed 198 methods of nonviolent action, and you can find a link to these in the video description below. Some of these can be done individually or in groups at the community level. Others can be done at various different levels of influence, and some were geared specifically to government action, even on the international level. So let's take a look at a few examples here. First one is rude gestures. And you can probably think of a lot of different rude gestures off the top of your head here, but let's focus on the actions of American football player Colin Kaepernick, who used his fame in order to bring awareness to racial injustice in the United States. And he did this by kneeling during the American national anthem at the beginning of football games. And kneeling during an anthem is a very rude gesture in the United States, as well as lots of other societies where you're supposed to stand during the national anthem. Another example are student strikes. So when young people, for example, walk out of classes in order to protest a cause they believe in, that is a form of nonviolent action. And one we can think about is a very recent one led by Greta Thunberg calling for climate action. Another example are consumers boycotts, when we want to challenge corporations to maybe change some of their practices that we feel are unethical. And the UK publication Ethical Consumer on their website lists a whole slew of different boycotts that are encouraged against companies for some of their practices. On a more national level, there's the rejection of authority. So the rejection of leaders in a country, and that can involve protests, that can involve different kinds of action, but an example of that is the current government crisis in Venezuela between the longtime leader Nicolas Maduro and his challenger Juan Guaido, both of whom claim the leadership of Venezuela. Different countries have supported either one or the other leader, and citizens in the country are putting their support behind one or the other leader in this currently unsolved constitutional crisis in Venezuela. Some governments have tools like this built into their governmental system. So in the United States, there's what we call the filibuster, where a member of Congress can stand at the podium for a long time just talking about anything as a way to stall votes on new legislation from happening so that those votes are delayed, and is again this sign of protest against the law. And this is part of the stalling and obstruction method of nonviolence. Another one is fasting, where to raise awareness for an issue, try to resolve conflicts between maybe a government and the people. Some leaders, like in this case, Theresa Spence, who was a leader of the Attawapiskat First Nation in Canada, underwent a hunger strike to raise awareness for Indigenous issues in Canada. And she was a major supporter of the Idle No More protest movement around the same time. On the international level, there is a method, for example, around the severance of diplomatic relations. So if you want to pressure a country to change their ways and resolve a conflict between states, you can sever diplomatic relations as a way of trying to force the issue there. Lots of countries, for example, have severed diplomatic relations with North Korea as a way to try and put pressure on North Korea to hopefully change their authoritarian system of government and give up nuclear weapons programs, all those kinds of things down the line. Right? So these non-violent methods of action are intended to influence parties with power to make change. And sometimes groups that try to make that change aren't even aware of this vast number of tactics and methods at their disposal that they can non-violently raise awareness to these issues and solve conflict without resorting to violence. And depending on the nature of the conflict or the nature of the issue, different methods, different combinations of methods may be more effective. Right? And ideally, we're going to nurture a society that has the absence of violence. And when conflicts arise, as they inevitably will, we can resolve those conflicts non-violently. But there should be a word of caution in there, because in places where some of those underlying issues that cause violence are still there, even non-violent actions can be triggering towards violent responses or violent retaliation. So that's something to keep in mind when we look at using non-violent action in different parts of the world. But at the end of the day, that's something maybe we want to aspire to in terms of conflict resolution, to be able to approach those different issues non-violently. And with that, thank you for watching, and we'll see you again next time.